Welcome back to the Hardware Unbox podcast. We're going to be talking about monitor technology, display technology today with our wonderful guest, Simon from TFTCentral. He's been on the podcast a couple of times before, and he's joining us from the UK to chat about everything that we saw at CES. The new ultra-wide OLEDs, the 4K RGB Stripe WOLED, your 5K and 6K monitors to talk about G-Sync Pulsar, high refresh rate stuff. If you love display technology, you love learning about the latest stuff that's coming out and things that we're expecting to see across the entirety of 2026, then this is the podcast for you. So let's get into it. So Simon, we were supposed to record this podcast episode actually live at CES in Las Vegas because we were both there. We ran into each other, and then one of our SSDs blew up, my SSDs, for when we were recording some footage at the MSI booth. And we had to go back and re-record a whole bunch of stuff. So unfortunately, the live podcast recording couldn't happen, but we've rescheduled it for a virtual call like we normally record these podcasts. So I'm back here in Australia. How's things been back in the UK since going over to Vegas and doing all that fun stuff?
Yeah, it's been good. Busy trying to catch up. Rainy back in the UK, not like in Vegas, but that's normal. But yeah, it was a super busy week. It's a shame we didn't get a chance to meet up in person and record this. But, you know, I don't know about you, but my week was just mad, hopping from venue to venue, trying to see everybody and see all the cool stuff that was going on. So, yeah, it's nice that we can at least catch up now a little bit after the fact and probably had a bit of time to digest it all and think about the highs and lows of the event. And, yeah, nice to catch up now again.
Yeah, it's a pretty crazy show. For people that don't know, CES is quite different to Computex in that at Computex, everyone's in the trade hall, basically. A few companies not in there, but you can just go and walk around and see all the things. At CES, it's like walking between meeting to meeting, all in different hotels, these massive hotels, different locations. So yeah, that's pretty crazy. But I think this was a good show this year, and it's been a good sort of opening to 2026 with the number of different types of monitors and new display technologies that we saw at CES. A lot of stuff some of the stuff we've already been able to test, like the new 34-inch ultra-wide QD-OLED, but then there's all sorts of other things that we're expecting to come out throughout the sort of start of the year. So we've got some content on our channel, Monitors Unboxed, and also you can go check out Simon's coverage on TFTCentral for all these sorts of things. But I thought a good way to kick this off would just be to give some brief thoughts on all of the new panel formats that we sort of saw and just some quick thoughts. So I'm going to start off with the 34-inch ultra-wide QD-OLED because we've both tested this panel. So full reviews available for the Asus and MSI models. And then I think we saw maybe one or two other variants of that available. So I guess the big change here is the move to the new V-Stripe or RGB Stripe subpixel layout. How did you sort of see that when you were testing it? Did you think this makes an actual noticeable difference to the image quality that people are getting?
Yeah, I think it did make a difference. It's one of those things that not everyone's had a problem with on previous gen QD-OLED anyway, but I think out of all of the panels that they had available, that 34-inch ultra-wide seemed to be the one where you were going to get the most benefit. You know, it's the lowest pixel density that they do at the moment. It was still on the original pixel layout and pixel shape from their very first gen panels back in 2022. And so you had the most drastic change potential there with the update. And I think it made a really nice difference, actually. Like, although not everybody had problems with it before, you know, you could certainly see fringing on text and weird outlines and things on the previous gen panels. But now it's shifted to a true RGB stripe layout, or V-Stripe as Samsung like to call it. It's just done away with all of that, really. And now it just looks the same as an equivalent LCD with that same kind of pixel density. So I think for those people who have been worried about text clarity and office work and kind of normal day-to-day usage on an OLED, I think it's a great step in the right direction. You know, goodness knows why they didn't have this layout in the first place, but you know, a few years down the line, at least it looks like they've addressed that. And yeah, let's hope for more of it across some of their other panels, I suppose. How did you find it?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, I thought it looked pretty much like an LCD now, which is, I think, what a lot of people were wanting. Yeah, maybe they thought this wasn't going to be the issue that it was with those original panels. It's always hard to know because there's obviously the possibility of manufacturing issues getting the layout that they wanted. I'm not sure. I guess one of the interesting things is when you look very closely, each of the subpixels is slightly different in size, even with the new RGB stripe. So maybe the sizing of them played a role previously. I don't actually know the technical reason, but hey, they've fixed it after 4 years. So hopefully we see this deployed across the vast majority of Samsung's QD-OLED displays. But as far as we're aware at the moment, it's only for the 34-inch ultrawide. Even when we saw Samsung display at the show, they weren't exactly saying like, hey, we've got a 27-inch 1440p coming out with this. All of that is being kept, I guess, under wraps for now, unless you've got other information at the moment.
No, I mean, I think they're pretty cagey about the rollout, which is reasonable. But I would expect the next thing would be a 1440p 27-inch, maybe even a refresh of their 49-inch super ultra wide, because they're the same pixel density as the 34-inch. And so it's a simple process. They're not having to handle a higher pixel density like they would on some of their other panels, like their 32-inch panel, their 27-inch 4K panel. I think that's a logical next step to roll that out across 27-inch 1440p and maybe the 49-inch, although that seems to be a pretty quiet segment. You don't see a lot of monitors launched in that size. So whether or not they bother to refresh that at the moment, I don't know. I think to your point about the different size subpixels, my understanding or my assumption is that it's because the OLED stack on QD-OLED emits a blue light. And so you end up with a smaller blue subpixel because the light behind it is blue. And then because they don't have to filter that through a quantum dot like they do the red and the green channels. And so those are then progressively larger, I think, to handle that conversion from the blue stack, the blue light emission, which is why they're slightly different sizes, I think.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
The other ultra-wide panel that we saw at the show was the 39-inch WOLED from LG Display, a format that I'm not sure if they showed it off last year in the 5K, 2K resolution, but no. I think it is coming out at some point this year. We've seen, I think it was only on display at LG Display. No, LG Electronics had a final version or an upcoming version as well. And so obviously one of the big things is it's a unique format. 39 inches only made by LG Display in the OLED format for now. And on top of that, the new resolution that will actually be bumping us up to a 4K class sort of resolution. So 39-inch ultrawide should have the vertical height of a 32-inch monitor, but with the additional width to bring it out to 39 inches. And in addition to that, they've changed finally the amount of curvature down from 800R, which was far too curved, to 1500R on the models that they've shown off so far. So we're getting now into the stuff that we've only seen on the show floor, not tested these versions fully, but this was, in my opinion, the most exciting OLED that at least I saw at CES.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, for me too. Yeah, so that's different to the 34-inch that we just talked about, which was QD-OLED. This is WOLED technology, so the competing technology from LG Display, as you said. And yeah, you're right. We just saw one actual monitor announced so far at CES from LG Electronics. We both saw that at their booth. It looked really good. I agree on the curvature. I think you can have those more aggressive curvatures on larger screens. It's not to everyone's taste, but it becomes a little bit more tolerable. But as you get onto those kind of smaller size formats, that if you can call 39-inch ultra-wide small, I don't know. But, as you get onto 39-inch and smaller, I think a more subtle curvature is going to be far more popular with people. And so that's got a 1500R curvature, as you said, now instead of the previous 800R. And yeah, I thought it looked a brilliant monitor. Really interested to see those released. I think they're coming out around April, May time, LG Electronics told me. So hopefully towards the start of Q2, we'll both have a chance to have a look at that and see how it performs. But I think that could be a really popular size and a really popular combination of resolution and format.
I think the only contentious thing with it, at least from LG Electronics model, is going with the matte finish, matte coating. I think, actually, I don't know or don't remember what LG Display said. I think they're producing a glossy version that some OEMs can use as well. However, LG Electronics specifically have implemented the matte version on their version. So it could be over to an Asus or one of those to make a glossy version. What are your sort of thoughts these days on the whole, like for WOLED, matte versus glossy? Do you approve of LG's choice?
I approve of giving consumers the choice. And so it's nice to see LG Display offer both options to manufacturers. So yeah, they did say that at the event, that moving forwards, their future panels will be available with the matte coating, the standard, or their glossy coating, which is branded under various different brand names, like Asus call it True Black Glossy and so on. So great to see a choice from their point of view. I've seen probably equal amounts of people saying, great, it's matte. I really want a matte screen, to handle reflections and glare. And then another portion of people who say, actually, why isn't it glossy? I can't wait for a glossy version from someone else, or whatever. I think the challenge a little bit on curved screens with a glossy is that it becomes quite hard to handle it becomes harder to handle the reflections than on a flat screen, because they end up getting distorted and stretched. I don't know if you've ever seen that on some of the QD-OLEDs, which are curved and have sort of a semi-glossy finish. And so I think a full glossy solution like you see on some of these smaller models might not be as great as some people think it would be, but I'd like to see the option for sure. I think people should have the choice, and if you can control reflections and glare, then great, it might be well suited to you, and it will certainly give a really nice, sharp, crisp and clear picture. But I think there's a word of warning about glossy on curves. It's not as easy to handle as on those flat models.
And what did you make of the 27-inch 4K RGB Stripe WOLED that LG Display didn't show off, but then Asus had at their little booth?
Yeah. Oh, LG Display had the panel, but LG Electronics didn't have their own model version.
Right.
Did they?
Yeah.
Which is weird, because that link between the two companies, you'd think they'd be first in line to get some of the new panels, but no, Asus have beaten them to the punch there. So yeah, we saw their monitor at the event, and then they kind of had the panel at LG Display's booth with they had a microscope set up to show close up of the pixels. A good positive change for people who want a panel that is going to be more not just for gaming, not just for multimedia and dynamic content, but also for work and maybe productivity applications, professional apps. I think LG Display are kind of pitching that as a panel choice for those kind of markets, as opposed to their traditional panels, which have the added white subpixel, which is probably going to be more suited to multimedia and movies and stuff, because it's going to be able to offer higher brightness and things like that. So I think that the 4K resolution is an interesting choice to roll it out on a 27-inch 4K as your first attempt, because that's a new format for them. So it's a new pixel density. They've had to perfect their manufacturing process to make that possible in the first place. Maybe that's easier without the fourth pixel. I don't know. But on a screen that size and with that pixel density, I suppose it's questionable whether it's really going to make much difference compared with a screen that might have the white subpixel still. I don't know, because we've never seen one, but we saw on QD-OLED, I think we both commented that on QD-OLED, moving to that size, that resolution, that pixel density, basically eliminated any text problems anyway, even with the old layout. So I guess I question whether it's really going to make a huge difference, but some people will certainly welcome it, and it's nice to see a change, I suppose. What about you? What did you think?
Yeah, I would have thought that if they were going to do an RGB stripe, that they'd debut it on a 1440p monitor, but I guess they've gone with this whole, let's put all the new tech into the one thing. The thing I'm really curious about is more, the brightness implications, not necessarily so much the lowering of peak white brightness or white luminance, because they have claimed that this panel is only going to be achieving up to around 1,000 nits. At least that's what Asus was saying, which is down from 1,300 or even 1,500 nits on some of their current other WOLEDs that do use the other, that have the white subpixel. But we don't actually know what this will mean for the color brightness side of things, because WOLED's been behind QD-OLED in color brightness for a while. So even on those monitors that do 1,300 or 1,500 nits full white, or 2% white window or whatever, they're only giving you the equivalent of 500 nits, white equivalent in terms of color brightness. So if you put up a QD-OLED at 500 nits up against a WOLED at 500 nits, you get roughly the same color brightness, but then the QD-OLED can go much higher than that as it pushes up to 1,000 nits white equivalent sort of levels. WOLED's never been able to do that, so it's always lagged behind in that sense. But now that they're moving across to the RGB stripe, they can't just quote unquote, not that it's cheating, but it's much easier to achieve those high white levels when you've got a white subpixel. Now they're claiming to achieve 1,000 nits without it. So does that mean we're also going to be getting increases to color brightness? I would be hoping so. We don't actually know unless you got any specific information from ASUS, but they seem pretty cagey on those sort of specs when I was asking them. But this could mean increases to overall picture quality and picture brightness in some scenes, even if 1,000, it's only achieving the 1,000 nits white spec.
Yeah, it's a quite a complicated area because there's a lot of different metrics, and understanding all the different variations is a bit complicated. But so LG Display told me as well that 1,000 nits is the expectation in terms of peak white luminance, and the other specs for like 10% APL, 100% full screen white, they're still being refined, or rather ASUS told me they were still being optimized because the panel is due to go into production in Q2, apparently early Q2. And so they're hopeful that they'll be able to push it up to brightness standards that would allow them to meet the True Black 500 certification tier from VESA instead of the 400 tier, which is the current expectation. And that's what LG Display have told me, that it would be True Black 400 certified. So it is a step back in overall brightness capabilities, but to be able to reach 1,000 nits with just an RGB stripe, it's got to be able to do that from an additive approach of red, blue, and green. So we should see that color brightness it's got to be able to add up to those, between the three of them. Otherwise, it just couldn't hit 1,000 nits anyway, because you haven't got the white subpixel to fall back on. So I think if you looked at color volume measurements, which are a bit of a complicated area, color volume is one of those things where on current WOLED, when you get into very dark scenes with peak highlights and you push, let's say, the 1,500 nits peak brightness that you see today advertised, then you get the combination of red, blue, and green up to a point. So maybe you get that up to 1,000 nits, and then anything beyond that is aided by the white boost. And so you get a collapse of the color volume if you're looking at stats like color volume, which is tricky in itself. But then if you remove the white subpixel, then the color volume should be perfect, really, because it should be able to go all the way up to the maximum peak brightness using the colors without needing the white boost. So I don't know. I suppose it depends how people are going to look at it. I think it's got the potential to be good but I'm a bit concerned that the brightness is going to take a big step back and people are going to be disappointed with that. But I think the way LG Display positioned it was, well, this isn't really for those kind of uses so much. It's for, people who are more focused on productivity and general applications and a bit of multimedia on the side. And if you want maximum brightness and maximum HDR impact, then you should be looking at a standard WOLED. So I think it remains to be seen, but it's sort of like an area of concern, I suppose, as a sacrifice for that RGB layout.
Yeah, and I guess from a competitive standpoint as well, the 27-inch 4K QD-OLED category only goes up to 1,000 nits in terms of white luminance and is a True Black 400 tier product anyway. So if you were just interested in that spec, it shouldn't be too different, or at least I'd be hoping it's not too different. But obviously, we're thinking also as well about like all the other formats that are available, the future of these technologies with the V-Stripe or RGB Stripe QD-OLED format. They've been able to push that to True Black 500 and with 1,300 nits peak. So it would be a little concerning if LG Display was sort of moving to a similar pixel format and not being able to achieve those sorts of specs. I don't know whether they're being conservative with it or whatever. And we also do see with the LG Display WOLEDs that the panel vendors, well, not the panel vendors, the monitor vendors seem to have a bit more flexibility over the brightness. The QD-OLED seems more locked down in what manufacturers can offer. So if Samsung displays, say, 1,000 nits, no OEM's really able to exceed that. But with WOLED, we have seen firmware updates, for example, improving the brightness of WOLEDs, or just variances between different different OEMs that are implementing these panels. So potentially, if a company wants to risk it, maybe they will be able to push above those specs against the wills of LG Display. But it seems like there's a bit more flexibility with that. But we'll just have to wait and see, because it seems like it'll be a very new panel with a lot of new things happening.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the thing with WOLED is it tends to be a brighter experience for HDR. You don't have the aggressive panel dimming that you see on QD-OLED as often, and ignoring peak numbers like 1300 nits versus 1000 nits. Actual real world performance may end up being brighter on a WOLED where they push the brightness for like 10%, 25% APL content, where you see a pretty drastic drop off normally on QD-OLED without some kind of hack to get around it, like different brightness boost modes and things. I think it remains to be seen, as you said, and I think it's definitely one. I mean, I'm keen to test later in the year. Looking forward to seeing it. I think it could be a popular option, and it's probably going to end up pretty similar to the QD-OLED options. I think overall, in terms of, well, obviously the same pixel density and size, but it could end up as a pretty similar overall performer, I think.
One of the other things that we saw a lot of at CES, perhaps surprising me a little bit, is the amount of new LCD panel formats that we saw. There's at least a few very interesting ones, including 5K LCDs, which we have sort of seen teased before, but seems to be coming in a more serious way with 165 hertz gaming options with dual mode. And then also Samsung showed off a 6K model, so even higher resolution, again, 165 hertz, again with dual mode support. So I'm assuming you've gone around and you've seen at CES all of those different sorts of panel formats. The 5K in particular has glossy and matte versions, some with dimming, some without local dimming. Do you think like 5 and 6K gaming is going to be a thing? Like, do you think these are actual viable, good panels that are going to move PC gaming forward?
Like you say, it was quite surprising to see so many LCDs at CES. I mean, who knew that they even existed, right? It's been OLED, OLED for 3 or 4 years now. I've almost forgotten that they were around. But yeah, I think some people are looking at those kind of 5K slightly wrong. Like the way I see it is the 5K resolution is not about giving gamers a 5K screen at 165 hertz or whatever that they expect to power at that kind of spec, because that's a crazy high resolution that most gamers aren't really going to be using for, well, anything competitive. Maybe some of those kind of graphically intensive games, slower paced, those kind of titles, maybe. But I think the 5K side of it is more for your kind of other non-gaming usage, your office applications, your desktop use, your productivity applications. Because when you get into 5K on the 20, so those were 27-inch size screens, the 5K models, and then the 6K that we saw from Samsung was a 32-inch size. When you get into those kind of resolutions, you get to the levels of pixel density that are supposedly, indiscernible to the naked eye from a normal viewing position. What Apple would call retina resolution. It's a marketing term, but I think it's probably useful to consider it. So on 27-inch, you've got 5K retina. 32-inch, you've got 6K retina. So I think that side of it is about giving people that amazing sharp picture quality for desktop apps and other usage, as well as good compatibility for things like Mac OS, because that handles scaling better when you've got, like a 5K resolution. And then I think the gaming side is then addressed by the dual mode function, which on a 5K screen, with dual mode, you're always having to quarter your resolution. So on a 5K screen, you drop from 5K to 1440p, which on a 27-inch size screen is then a really nice, comfortable resolution, a normal resolution, in fact, for a 27-inch screen. So for gaming, you've got the option then of going 1440p, dual mode, double your refresh rate up to 330 hertz. And that's a far more achievable, typical gaming format than worrying about 5K 165. But you've kind of got this hybrid, this best of both worlds, this office and productivity monitor with an amazing picture quality and pixel density without having to sacrifice refresh rate for gaming. You've got that through the dual mode function. So I guess that's how I've been looking at it. I don't know. What do you think? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I feel like with the dual modes that we have seen up until now, they're useful in some sense, but they do feel quite compromised. Like, especially if you're going from, let's say, the 32-inch 4K WOLED models, which have 4K 240 hertz and then 1080p 480 hertz. Yeah, 480 hertz is clearer. It looks better from that sense. But on a 32-inch screen, like, it does feel like you're sacrificing a lot to go down to 1080p for gaming, and it really makes it largely, in my opinion, for competitive gaming. If you're still playing those, slower single-player games, you'll probably be wanting to use the 4K mode. Whereas on a 5K monitor at 1440p in the dual mode, it's possible that you'll just want to use that for everything, especially because 1440p 27 inches is going to look a lot more dense than, say, 32-inch 1080p. And assuming that they get the things like the pixel scaling and all that looking as close as they can to native 1440p panels, I think people will be really keen on using that. It was pretty hard on the show floor to get a good look at how the 1440p mode works and looks. The 5K mode looks incredible on these screens, and the 6K mode in the Samsung, if you're looking at the desktop and that sort of thing, is clearly, in my opinion, sharper than a 4K monitor. I know some people say things like diminishing returns for 5K and 6K resolutions. I think for things where you've got text on screen, you can genuinely notice the increased, as you put it, sort of retina resolution that they offer. So for people that are using them for productivity tasks, I think 5K and 6K are going to be genuinely useful. And then on top of that, for the productivity uses, it's not just about the sharpness, but the real estate that you get. So from things that we do, like video editing, 6K in particular is quite attractive because there's a lot of room that you can use for the UI of an editing application, but you can still have a native 4K like part of the screen that you can use to preview the content that you're working on, or similar for, Photoshop, where you might be working on a 4K image. You'll be able to do that at the native 100% resolution while still having UI elements around it. Whereas on a 4K monitor, you kind of do have to scale it to some sense. So, and of course, native is always better. You see fewer artifacts when you're editing photos and things like that if you can view the image natively. So I think these will be very interesting dual use monitors from that sense, especially the 5K ones that we saw with, I think it's 2,304 dimming zones. Hopefully this will give you sort of all the dual use cases that you might need, like 5K for your productivity, and then the 1440p 330 hertz mode for gaming, but then also potentially HDR gaming of decent quality as well. So it should be this sort of all-rounder type product. I'm hoping, MSI told me that they weren't even 100% sure they'll be releasing their model. I'm hoping that this format is successful enough that it justifies all these options. But it seems like, considering we saw, I don't know how many, at least 4 or 5 models from different brands, that they're seeing the value in it and they're sort of progressing ahead with it.
Yeah, I agree. And to your point about the 32-inch 4K dual modes that we've seen, like we've seen them from WOLED already, that kind of combination it's not good enough to be 4K on 32-inch isn't good enough for that retina resolution class. And then, like you say, dropping down to 1080p on a 32-inch size screen is not that great. Whereas 27-inch screen 5K dropping down to 1440p is a much better combination for that kind of dual mode support. And I think for any Mac OS users, Mac handles the scaling is better when it's an integer scaling, like in this case, it would be a 4x scaling. So you'd have the actual resolution of 5K, but the logical viewable resolution of 1440p. That will give you the retina resolution, retina desktop and everything. But it handles that kind of thing better than if it was an odd number, like if you were trying to do a 4K resolution screen down to 1440p. That isn't an integer scaling translation. So I think it's got a lot of good use cases. I'm glad to see that there were a couple of monitors, I think, with mini LED. I think we saw MSI's model, one from HKC, they had a mini LED, and then you had others like MSI had a non-mini LED, Asus had a non-mini LED, which is, I think, already been released very recently, or at least for pre-order, and Acer, I think, also had one. So there's kind of a choice then if you want mini LED for decent HDR and top-end LCD performance, or if you're not really bothered about that and you want to save a bit of money, then you've got the kind of standard LCD offerings as well. But yeah, I think they look really good, and they were well priced as well. They were. I
think I was told, Asus's model is 600-ish without mini LED, and I think MSI was saying maybe more like 800 for the mini LED model, but those are non-final prices, especially because MSI, again, they sort of didn't seem convinced that it was coming out. I'm not 100% sure whether that meant in certain regions or whatever, but they were sort of gathering feedback on whether that panel was worth making. I think Acer's model is confirmed at 800. as well. So that's a final price.
MSI told me that I've got an early spec sheet for it now, and they told me that their expectation was their expectation was that it would be released in H2. They didn't make it sound to me like it was not happening, but then I suppose that's far enough away that things may change. But I think we'll see some from some of the vendors at least. There should be a good choice, and it would be a shame if MSI miss out on that, because their model, they had a glossy screen coating, which I know some people are like, and look really good.
The other LCD format that we saw was these new 500 hertz 1440p IPS LCDs, again with the dual mode, but a fairly useless dual mode of 720p when that sort of resolution is the standard. And they claim 1000 hertz or even as far as 1080 hertz on HKC's model. I did use the Blurbuster's UFO test on Ace's model at 500 hertz, and the results were quite bad, I would say, quite blurry at 500 hertz. So I'm very questionable about whether 1000 hertz is going to be doable in any sense outside of the sort of smoothness and latency side of things. I don't know how much you were able to sort of look at the motion on these sorts of panels, but I'm not convinced that the response times of LCDs in their current format, the IPS LCDs being used for these panels, can actually support these refresh rates, but they're coming out this year at some point. So it's a thing.
I didn't have chance to test it properly at CES. It just wasn't possible. Some of the screens you couldn't even put into the dual mode function.
That's right. Yeah,
I think HKC had the test UFO running, but it was only running at like 500 hertz or 600 or whatever their native was. Like you say, I'm really skeptical about the ability of this is IPS as well. This isn't even TN film. This is an IPS LCD keeping up with the kind of frame rate demands of 1000 hertz. You need consistent sub 1 millisecond response times for that to be even viable without adding additional smearing. And I just think, from what I've seen in the past, I think that's unrealistic. We've seen a few really good IPS response time panels. We'll probably talk about Pulsar in a minute, but there's a good example of a 360 hertz panel with really good response times for an LCD. But I don't think even that would be able to keep up anywhere near with 1000 hertz. And I just think it feels like it's a gimmick, a marketing, chasing numbers. They've seen these super fast OLEDs come out. Don't forget us. Don't forget the LCDs. Look, we can do 1000 hertz. But it's at 720p resolution, which is super niche in terms of a use case anyway, I think. Maybe they'll be more practical at their kind of native 1440p, 500 hertz, 600 hertz. Maybe that could be interesting if the response times are decent enough. But I feel like the 1000 hertz mode is just a gimmick, really. Maybe I should reserve judgment until I've tested one properly, but I'm skeptical.
I think even just the resolution, I believe we've both tested the 720p dual mode on an OLED before, right?
Yeah.
You've tested the Asus model. So just from a resolution standpoint, 720p is useless in some games. Just the UI elements are just not designed for 720p monitors anymore. They're really designed for a minimum of 1080p. So it can be very difficult to view text in games running them at 720p. I know when I was testing the Asus model in games like CSGO, so the sorts of games that, or CS2 now, the sorts of games that you would use these high performance modes for, it's nice that you get a little bit of an increase in motion clarity, but then you're sacrificing the actual readability of the game. It may work in some games depending on how their UI works, but some of the options that I tested were very difficult to view. And so on the 1440p monitor, same sort of size, but it's LCD. I mean, you're going to run into the same problems. So that's going to make the dual mode quite difficult to recommend, even without factoring in the response times, the refresh rate side of things. Yeah, for the 500 hertz, it's going to depend, because the current best monitors that we've got are around 360 hertz for IPS LCDs at that resolution. So there is obviously the potential that maybe they'll be able to do, let's say, 400 hertz or something with acceptable speed, but not 500 or 600 hertz. So it's possible that they're able to offer some benefit that we haven't gotten before, but actually achieving the full 500 or 600 hertz or whatever, I think is going to be pretty challenging to do. The other point, though, I guess, is that the pricing that we've sort of been hinted at for these models doesn't sound overly high. Like they're still talking about, these aren't going to be $1,000 monitors, because I think the 360 hertz ones that we've seen previously have been, the Asus, the PG27AQN was $1,000 when it launched, I think, supporting things like ULMB2 eventually. All the sorts of high performance monitors that we've seen have been super expensive, but I believe these are going to be more in that sort of $400 to $500 US range. And that's going to mean that, even if they're not technically 500 hertz based on testing, they may still offer something for people and not be fully useless options. It just depends how competitive they are with the existing 360 hertz models that we've seen. But it doesn't seem like backlight strobing is too much of a focus for these products either. So I don't think they're going to be implementing things like ULMB2 in those monitors to begin with, which might have strengthened the offering if the speed was fast enough. But it just seems like it's, as you put it, sort of more of a marketing gimmick in a sense that they can now run the panel that fast, but not necessarily transition fast enough. So
you can push the refresh rate, but I would have been more interested in it if that had been an OLED refresh rate. Because although 720p is very limited in use cases, at least I would have felt like 1,000 hertz would have been practical from a pixel response time point of view. It would have been able to keep up, and motion clarity would have been amazing, as it was on 720 hertz. But yeah, I look forward to seeing what they're looking like later in the year. I think there were models from who had them. There was HKC, or their Ant Gamer brand had one, Acer, Samsung. I think it was just the three. But there should be a reasonable selection of those coming out. I think Philips and AOC, they weren't at CES, but they've got models as well that have been announced, or product pages have been released recently. So yeah, I guess wait and see on those.
The next we've sort of recapped most of the panels that we see, the new formats that we've shown off at CES and the content that we've made. I'm interested in sort of just a discussion on the immediate future of OLED. I think at this point, we've seen a lot of new panel formats come out to the market quite quickly. They've sort of tried to fill out the main categories that people are using, like your 32-inch 4K, 27-inch at different resolutions. Are we happy with the sort of panel formats that are being offered at the moment? Like, are there any gaps that you sort of see that could be addressed by panels? To me, I sort of see the 27-inch WOLED as almost one of the last mainstream offerings that needed to be produced, but it seems like a lot of the other options are filled. So I was just wondering whether you sort of see that as more complete, or are there things that you're hoping that will be released from the main panel manufacturers?
There's two that get mentioned all the time when I talk about like panel roadmaps and latest updates for 2026 and all that kind of stuff. Whether or not I want them personally is different, but it'd be a shame not to mention them because I know people will ask about them. So the first would be a small format, like a 24-inch size, 24.5-inch size. That kind of esports market has been very limited in the last few years to kind of super high refresh rate, but TN film panels, so good for gaming. And you've got, various strobing, blur reduction, backlight modes that are, great for motion clarity, but super limited for picture quality, non-existent HDR, everything else, weak colors, really poor viewing angles, so I think a 24-inch sized OLED, if you could have I think most people who are looking for a screen that size would probably want a 1080p model, and I'm talking for esports and competitive gamers really. So 24-inch 1080p, and then just push the refresh rate as high as you can. If you could have a 1000 hertz OLED with that kind of spec, I think that would fit that niche really well, and probably kill off most of the kind of lower quality TN film and LCD options that exist in that size if it was decent enough. So that one, I'd love to see that. I think we probably both fed back to Samsung and LG Display at one point or another that's a niche that we'd like to see explored. I think they both said to me, we hear you, we're looking at it, no firm plans, no news, but it is on our radar. And then the other one that I think is probably more of a personal thing, but I know there's a sort of a niche of people who really like this format, is that kind of 38-inch 24:10 aspect ratio that was only ever briefly explored with IPS panels a few years back. But it's a really it's almost like an ultra wide version of the old 16 by 10 aspect ratio models that some people still love and talk about. I think, maybe that's an untapped segment for, with an extra vertical height. So they had like a 3840 by 1600 resolution. So you had the same resolution as 4K from a horizontal perspective, but then an ultra wide format. But 1600 just gave you that extra desktop space for like you said earlier, like video editing and applications. And this one I've got right here behind me, that's a 38-inch that I still use, quite often for those kind of uses, writing and editing and that kind of thing. And I think an OLED of that size could be popular with some people. It's not really been explored much in any monitor format before, but I know people ask about it all the time whenever I talk about kind of panel developments and changes. So I don't know, what about you? Do you think that's a bit too niche?
Potentially. I mean, the 39-inch, like for me personally, I think the 39-inch 5K, 2K is probably going to serve me okay for that sort of use case, but I know that it's sort of a different size when you got 3840 by 1600. So yeah, it is a different format. I think for me, I mean, I would like to see all of the formats being produced by both Samsung and LG Display. So obviously, I think the WOLED 27-inch 4K was the obvious gap that's being solved this year. But then on the QD-OLED side, they're not making a 45-inch ultra wide just yet, at least. So I think that is something that I really do like the 45-inch ultra wide format. It's sort of the largest feasible ultra wide that you can have on a desk without it getting absolutely insane. And so having a QD-OLED option for people who prefer the characteristics of QD-OLED, I think would be beneficial. And then if we're talking
as well,
and that's the 39-inch,
yeah,
yes, that's right. So filling out the ultra wide formats with those, I think would be good. And then as far as the formats that we haven't talked about, that you haven't brought up, that they could explore that are sort of more new, I think if they were going to go with a higher resolution in terms of like 5K or 6K options, I would like to see them explore just a 16 by 9 monitor that's larger than 32 inches. So whether that's like a 36 or 38-inch 16 by 9 format flat, but with that higher resolution. I think once you start getting to the TV sizes like 42 and especially 48-inch, they're kind of ridiculous. Like they're niche because of their size. It's quite difficult to accommodate for a lot of people, even though I know there are plenty of people that love those formats. But I think having something that was 38 inches, maybe 5 or 6K, would offer people, it's not quite as big as the 42, so usable on maybe a few more desks, but a lot higher pixel density. The pixels per inch would be similar to a 4K monitor or whatever the case is once you do the calculations at maybe 32 inches. And so you would get this, a lot more screen real estate for people. I'd like to see sort of that larger format explored. I'm just not sure how popular it would be or whether it would justify sort of like the development of trying to make something like that. Yeah, I know Samsung Display are exploring like 27-inch 5K. I'm not sure how beneficial 5K 27-inch OLED would be for gaming. Obviously, there's productivity benefits, but if that resolution was available on a much larger monitor, I think it could be attractive, but I don't see them actually making that ever. So that's probably just a pipe dream sort of wish thing from me.
Yeah, I think we've seen a couple of LCDs in the past of that kind of format and size. I remember an Asus 38-inch, I think it was, LCD of some sort, an IPS. I think, it could be interesting, like you say, if you had 6K resolution, maybe even higher, you could push that up to 8K maybe and have a, Retina class resolution again, but on an even larger screen. But I think, it'd be interesting. Or you could go with a low resolution and it could be a gamer focused screen. But I agree that those kind of anything larger, when you get into 42 inches and above, there are people who have those screens and love those screens, and panels still exist in those sizes. LG Display still make them, but they're reserved for TVs. And I think certainly all of the monitor manufacturers that I've spoken to in the past have all said, that's basically a dead segment to us now. It was a stopgap a few years ago before OLED became a thing in the monitor space. And, you saw Asus, Gigabyte, a few others launch 42-inch, 48-inch size screens. But now there's just such a big selection of actual monitor size panels that I think from a monitor point of view, it's dead. But you'll continue to see TVs, manufactured in that size. LG's C series is always really popular. They've got their C6 this year, which will be available from 42 inches and above. So you've got options, but yeah, I'd like to see maybe something in between, but I don't think it's ever really been explored. So it's a bit hard to know whether it would be popular or not. You know, we've never really had that as an option. So who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel like the focus that they've taken away from the 42-inch panel format, and at least LG Display in the gaming side of things is more focused on, well, if you're buying a monitor that big, may as well make it an ultra wide, hence offering the sort of 45-inch ultra wide that they do, which I think isn't as tall as the 42-inch model, but is certainly like larger than 4K 32-inch sort of size in terms of vertical height. So I guess that's the way that they're sort of pushing things. I know there's been other formats that have been looked at for monitors, like the 57-inch ultra wides and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Again, like they could probably make an OLED of that, and I'm sure some people would like it, but you're talking about sort of huge formats at that point, and how popular that 57-inch LCD option was, I'm not 100% sure. I know I do know a few people that actually own one of those and they love it, but outside of that, I don't think that was as popular as even the 49-inch, QD-OLEDs and that sort of double 1440p option.
Yeah, that was a dual 4K resolution, wasn't it? And it was, I think, pretty niche. I mean, super high spec. It was dual 4K, 240 hertz, mini LED. But I think it always felt to me like a bit of a proof of concept, test the waters. Is there a demand for this kind of size? But that's a huge size screen, a huge ultra wide. I mean, a 49-inch is already crazy when you get one of those on your desk, but a 57-inch was even, just insane, really. And I think at CES we saw a couple of like 52-inch LCD screens.
Yeah.
So I think those were the ones that were the same vertical height equivalent as the 42-inch screen, but then obviously with a wider ultra wide format. So I saw LG Electronics had a pretty steep curve and 1000R curvature gaming focused 5K 2K resolution screen, but that was LCD IPS, not OLED at the moment. Again, I think it feels like they're probably just going to test the water with that kind of size and format and see whether it's popular or not. And then there were some other options, like Dell had a more kind of professional oriented 52-inch, much more subtle curvature, 6K ultra wide resolution that was looked brilliant, but not a gaming screen by any stretch, and more for multitasking, productivity, that kind of thing. So it seems like people are exploring those kind of super large screens, like 52-inch ultra wide, that kind of thing. But you really are getting into needing a huge desk space for that kind of screen. I think it's pretty massive.
Yeah, companies always are exploring this sort of how to replace two monitors with one monitor sort of format. So that's probably why we're seeing the 52-inch sort of 6K Dell option coming into play. But yeah, for gaming, I don't expect it to be overly popular if they do decide to make that sort of format. But again, you never know. Giving people options is always a good idea, I think. But obviously, the way the OLED manufacturers have gone so far is just targeting what they think is the most popular options. I think they definitely have done that. 27-inch, 32-inch, very, very safe options. The 34-inch ultra wide, which has sort of been the forefront of what Samsung has done with a lot of their tech. That's a very safe format as well. That's been popular for a long time. And I think the 39-inch as well will become quite popular once they finally start producing them. So yeah, all of those formats, I think they've made them because they're the options that people generally tend to gravitate towards. And then all the experimental stuff, I think, will probably come and go as they can find new ways to sort of market them for certain things. Like the 49-inch, they can sort of say, well, this is a dual QHD, or this is perfect for your simulator rigs and those sorts of things. So as long as there's one of those angles, they might do it. But outside of that, I think we'll largely just see iterations on the current technologies, increases in refresh rate and resolution, and improvements to the emission layers and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and it feels like they've, it's been a few years now. They were first launched in 2022, so we're into the fourth year now of OLED monitors, and it feels like we've come on quite a lot, I think, from those kind of early iterations. We've seen obviously massive advancements in refresh rate. The first model that was released was 175 hertz. Now 500 hertz plus is pretty much the standard, and getting beyond that is great, but not everybody needs that. But then we've seen all kinds of additional changes, higher pixel densities, RGB Stripe this year, higher brightness, We didn't really touch on some of the other QD-OLED optimizations earlier, actually, like the new panel film and the panel coating options and stuff. We've seen glossy options, and I think it's developed really quickly. There's been a lot of focus, obviously, from the panel manufacturers, the display manufacturers, a lot of investment focus, and I think it's come on a lot. For all those people who say the monitor market doesn't move very fast, I think it really has in that OLED space. And all the while, they've been improving things like lifespan and durability and reducing the risk of image retention. Maybe we should talk about that briefly a little bit later. It might be an interesting topic, but I think, all these kind of early teething problems with OLED are kind of being slowly ironed out. There are other issues that are arising, of course. Nothing's perfect, but it's come on a lot, I think.
Yeah, we always get the complaint on Monitors Unboxed that it's OLED unboxed because all we focus is on OLED monitors. But you're right about the pace of development of OLED has been pretty crazy. Like, we've seen a lot of new formats that really have filled out the lineup quite quickly, while additionally enhancing the technologies that they're offering. I think we're starting to see, at least based on what we've seen so far, like the CES wave of announcements. There hasn't been as many of those this year as we've seen in previous years. The previous two CESs, for example, last year we got the first 27-inch 4K panels, and the year before that was the first 32-inch 4K panels and the first, I would say, gaming or desktop-focused 4K OLEDs of any kind. So the advancements are sort of slowly dying off as they're filling out the lineups with all of the panel formats that they can offer, and it's moving more into iteration a little bit. For example, there is a new 2026 32-inch 4K QD-OLED, which is, slight differences, but that's more of what I would be expecting to see once these lineups are filled out. You would see one year maybe they'll push the brightness spec up a little bit or change the emissive layer, or, maybe QD-OLED will finally fix panel dimming at some point. Maybe they'll do that and deploy it. But I think once they've gotten to this point where it seems like almost they were surprised, the panel manufacturers, at how popular OLED would be for desktops, even though every single person was telling them, screaming at them, please make these panels forever. Once they finally started doing it, it seemed even then it was surprising how popular they were. And it's been this rush to make sure that they're offering all of the options that they need to be offering. And now that that's done, I think, things might change a little bit. But even pricing developments, I expect to continue to be pretty crazy with how cheap these monitors will become as competition is very, very high.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you're right, they've got the panel sizes, they're producing them, they know what they're doing, they've got the yield rate high enough to make these viable and cost effective. And now they're looking at the optimizations that people have been asking for: higher refresh rates, better pixel layouts, higher brightness. Brightness we're seeing improve quite decent advancements in the last year or so, with True Black 500 certification pretty widely used now, 1300 nits peak on QD, 1500 nits on WOLED. They're looking to address things on QD-OLED that have been a problem, like trying to improve some of the ambient light handling, the blacks that go purple or gray when you have a light that is in front of the screen. They've improved that a bit this year with a new black film. They don't have a marketing name for it, but Asus call it Black Shield, MSI call it Dark Armor, and so on.
Yeah.
But that did a really a pretty decent job, I thought. It obviously doesn't fix the issue, but it does remove the purple tint that you saw, and blacks look more black now in the presence of ambient lighting. So that's a nice advancement. And then they're now offering, at a panel level, Samsung Display are now offering an anti-glare coating option for manufacturers to take if they want. So we're starting to see OLED also filter down into that kind of professional segment more as well. So like Dell had a new screen, Asus had a new screen, these kind of OLED professional screens that are clearly not aimed at gaming and dynamic content. They're clearly aimed at static desktop usage and applications and that kind of thing. And so there must be, the panel manufacturers must be more trusting of their OLED material now. They must have got to the stage where they're confident that the lifespan is long enough and the panels are durable enough to handle that kind of prolonged static usage. It's always going to be a challenge and a risk and a concern, but I think that's come on a lot in the last few years. I think with the mitigation measures that are introduced and the human motion sensors and that kind of thing, and all the OLED care features, and then the more durable later gen panels. I think we're starting to see it now broaden out into that kind of office space as well. So it's not just the gamers anymore, and that will only help, with offer more choice in those segments.
I think people underestimate how good using an OLED is for productivity use. There's sort of been this idea that you don't really need an OLED. You can get away with an LCD. It's fine enough for productivity. And we've seen this with even things like refresh rates, where some people at least have insisted that 60 hertz is good enough for productivity work, when I would strongly disagree with that. They're great panels for gaming, but there's plenty of benefits for productivity use as well. Whether you're using applications that require deep blacks or shadow detail, OLEDs are fantastic for that. But even things just like scrolling through documents and spreadsheets and web pages on an OLED looks a lot nicer than on an LCD of a similar refresh rate. They're capable of higher refresh rates, and just that general experience, especially while I know they're offering sort of some of these matte options now, even the glossy panels I think are quite suitable, especially the QD-OLED, which does handle reflections a bit better than WOLED. I think that they're very suitable panels. I've been using one for 2 years now as a productivity monitor, and I think it's clearly better than the LCDs I was using previously. So obviously those benefits, at some point people will want them for these productivity uses, not just for gaming. And, the testing that I've done on the channel with the QD-OLED, trying to burn it in over time, doing this really aggressive sort of let's not use many of the mitigations that people tend to want to use, I think it has shown that, while I am seeing burn-in in some areas, it's not devastating. Like for productivity use, there are times where I'm like, it's kind of annoying. But for most of the time, like if I'm just writing a document or doing some Excel spreadsheets, it is a complete non-issue. It's very difficult to see the burn-in. I'm definitely not at that level where, individual icons are burning in, or there's like a logo burnt in somewhere on the screen. It's still faint enough that you really do have to look at specific test patterns or some of those applications that have really dark uniform backgrounds. And so I think if people are sort of using the panel a bit more sensibly, like using dark mode, which I know a lot of people prefer for productivity anyway, so it's not necessarily a compromise, it's just maybe a better way to use the panels. I think if people are doing those sorts of things, that you'll see genuinely good lifespans from these products. Maybe not the best sort of like, maybe it won't last 7 years, which is probably around the acceptable level when you're spending $1,000. But I think it should last long enough that they do become actual viable productivity monitors, and people aren't needing to replace them within like 2 years or 3 years. Because I remember back when people started using the OLED TVs for productivity, and people were seeing pretty serious burn-in within like 6 months or even 12 months. I don't think that'll be the case on these panels for the vast majority of people, especially if they're using them with all the default features, OLED care features enabled, and using it sensibly with the Windows features as well.
Yeah, and your usage and testing is I guess a pretty extreme case in that you're using it all the time for productivity. There's no kind of gaming or dynamic content within that, as I understand it. And so
yeah.
So if you're a general user who's going to be, you're probably going to buy an OLED if you're a gamer or you're wanting it for HDR or multimedia anyway. But to use it for periods of time for static use and desktop use, I don't think is a problem at all. And, there's been further advancements in panel durability since the model that you've been testing as well. So, newer and newer panels, they always improve these things, and there's newer OLED care features. And I think it's something to be aware of, but I just don't think it's a concern, or it shouldn't be a concern for most people. It's the number one thing that people always seem to come and comment on, any kind of new OLED news or OLED review. Oh, I'm not getting an OLED because of burn-in. But things have come on a lot in the last few years, a significant way, to the point where, pretty much every manufacturer's offering a 3-year burn-in warranty. Pretty much everyone's now starting to consider using them for monitors that are designed for static and professional usage. These are signs that the faith in the technology is there now, and it's they've tested the water for a number of years, and it's not the problem that I think a lot of people think that it is. And I'd encourage people to try an OLED, because, like you say, the benefits even for general usage for viewing angles and colors and contrast and HDR performance is just stuff that you won't get from a decent, even the best LCDs. So yeah, long live OLED unboxed, I say.
Yeah, well, the way the market's going and the prices are decreasing to the point where from the mid-range and up, a lot of people will probably be considering OLED anyway. I think with the burn-in stuff, there's probably only a few things that I'd be really concerned about. Like, for example, it still isn't ideal to leave, like, let's say you're going out for lunch or something and you're going to be a couple of hours. On an LCD, you can pretty safely just leave your screen on at maximum brightness. It won't do anything. On an OLED, probably not the best to do that. You probably are better just to preserve the longevity by turning it off or using one of the features that's built into monitors to dim it, or using, maybe you just have to enable the auto dimming or auto display turn off feature in Windows. But it's not something that really affects the usability of the screen because you're not there looking at it. So it doesn't really matter what the screen's doing. It's just something that you might not have considered if you were using LCD previously because it was always fine. So it's just a few of those things that, you can optimize. But even just straight out of the box, I think most people, if they're just using it in the default way, are probably not going to run into massive issues unless they're, again, like looking at test patterns and things like that and sort of viewing these things. And we see this with, the WOLED color banding problems, with dark grays and that sort of thing. I don't know what your opinion is, having seen and used monitors with this, but we do see, if you look at certain test patterns, it is problematic, but then a lot of the general content that you're using on these WOLEDs, it doesn't really come up. So just, I guess, like with the burner sort of thing, it depends on how you're using it. But how have you sort of seen the color banding issue, the key talking point for these WOLEDs, especially the tandem ones?
Yeah, this is one of those things that's come up more recently. I think test patterns are a dangerous thing, for the masses to use. The last thing you want to do, I think, in my opinion, is to buy a new screen, have it delivered, plug it in, and then immediately load up a test pattern, because it's not. Firstly, a test pattern is not, representative of what your real usage is going to be. And then secondly, these screens have come from storage, from transport. They need a period of time to settle, to bed in, whether it's an LCD or particularly an OLED. And I've seen a lot of OLED manuals, and nowadays are saying when you first get the screen and plug it in, you should be running a panel refresh cycle straight away, because it gives a chance to even out and to level out the voltage and the OLED layer and all kinds of optimizations. But I think, like, the issue with the banding, this is like stripes or artifacts particularly in dark gray content. The classic test pattern is a really dark gray slide. But again, are you ever viewing that in normal usage? But you're seeing it sometimes on, like, I think the thing that brings it out for a lot of people is like dark themes, Windows dark theme, Chrome dark theme, that kind of thing. You get those kind of solid dark gray backgrounds, and people are seeing these banding artifacts on WOLED. And it's certainly there. You can see it, you can find it. It does seem to vary from panel to panel. It's something that I've been looking at in a lot of detail recently, and perhaps by the time this podcast is published, I'll have a full article on the topic, because that's something I've been working on. I've been talking to the guys at ratings.com on it as well, just yesterday actually, on it, because they've measured this in the past as well. And I think for the vast majority of people, I don't think it's going to be obvious during normal everyday usage. Sure, if you go and load up a test pattern, you might see it, but I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a great thing to do, is to examine your screen with unrealistic test patterns that you're not going to be viewing during normal usage. And I think it's an interesting topic. It'll be more information to come on that, really. Like, I'm still kind of halfway through exploring the ins and outs of it on tandem OLED, on previous gen WOLED, on QD-OLED, gathering feedback from display manufacturers, from LG Display. So hopefully it's like a bit of an in-depth deep dive on that topic about what's causing it, what you might be able to do to improve it, that kind of thing, in the future, or in the near future.
It's an unfortunate artifact that people are seeing in some cases. I think I have seen, or I've been sent from users, some really bad examples where it's in games they are seeing, maybe it's a dark HDRC and they are seeing significant banding. But I think, based on at least my testing, what I've seen, obviously I can get it to happen if I want it to. Like if I want to go to a dark gray background, 100% I can make it happen. And it does depend on the application as well. So, there are some real world applications, like you sort of mentioned, these dark mode apps where it's potentially happening. But even based on the monitors that I have, and I would say I've got maybe half a dozen WOLEDs. I think there's only been one of them where I've sort of seen it more in those real world applications. All of them, you can see it in the test patterns, but I think it was either the Gigabyte or the Asus Tandem one, but not both of them. Only one of them, it was noticeable in some some applications. You could see the uniformity problems, which suggests to me that it is a panel variance, like the level to which you see it is going to be down to the specific panel that you purchase. And certainly some of the examples that I've been sent, I haven't been able to replicate on my units just because of how the issue isn't as prevalent on the ones that I've gotten. And that might just be from using them more. They're running through more of the compensation cycles, which is supposed to improve that particular artifact. So yeah, certainly across the gaming that I've done on WOLEDs, like the actual, like that's what it's designed for. Let's run it through some games, even dark HDR content. It is quite hard to notice in a lot of cases. And I don't think it should be an issue for most people, as you've sort of said.
Yeah.
But then again, I've sort of been told that it isn't a fixable problem with these panels that are currently being produced. So it's not something that they can just release a firmware update for and you'll see no banding. It is part of how the panel is designed to work. And so they can optimize it as much as they can, but it is still an inherent characteristic, kind of like the panel dimming that we see on QD-OLEDs that seems to be inherent to the way the technology currently works. And certainly LG Display is aware of this. So it's not like they're sitting around going, oh, we're so shocked that, people are finding out this problem. They're well aware that this is something that's a problem, but they're sort of trying to mitigate it as best as they can. And I think for people that are seeing those really severe issues, like some of the examples I've been sent, I would just be RMAing the panel, because I have seen models that I've received that are not nearly as severe as that. So if there are problems in that sense, just try get a new one, say it's defective, point to hardware unbox videos saying that you should get an RMA because it's defective, and then just try your luck and get a better panel. Now, of course, that sucks. It sucks to be recommending things and people having to go RMA them to get decent models. But this was a thing with IPS glow as well, which is, again, something that can actually settle and improve over time. People take their monitors out. As you sort of said, they're like, oh, I bought a new IPS LCD. How bad's the IPS glow? So they take it out of the box. They're immediately showing full black content. Whereas with IPS LCDs, there can be a settling period of multiple weeks before the panel actually expands out of the packaging to the final settling point. Because of the way the layers are glued and all that sort of thing that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, but IPS glow is something that does improve over the course of a few weeks. And so, taking your monitor out and just immediately slamming it with test patterns is probably not recommended. But certainly if you're seeing the problems after, let's say, 2 weeks, or you've run a few compensation cycles on the WOLED and it's not really improving, then I would say that's grounds for a replacement.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, like you say, LG Display are aware of it. I've had some technical detail from them that, I'm still exploring with them, but will be in the article about, what's causing this and, further responses from them. But I agree, if you've got a really bad case, then certainly RMA it. It's no different from LCDs where you might have like bad IPS glow, backlight bleed, dead pixels even, these problems that have always been around. Some people have bad samples, some people have good samples. But the one thing I wouldn't do is base a decision or panic on a first hookup of the monitor. I would not unbox it, plug it in and run a test pattern, and then worry that I've got a really bad example. I would give it at least a couple of weeks to bed in, plenty of hours of usage, some dynamic content, run some panel refresh cycles manually, run that a handful of times if you need to. Just give it a chance to settle after all the storage and the shipment and the different temperatures and the different environments, and see whether it's a problem in your actual usage. Don't go looking for it in test patterns. If you go looking for anything, you're going to find something that's a problem. But see whether it's a problem in your usage. And if it is, and it's really distracting, RMA it, because there are good samples out there. It does seem to be a bit of a lottery. Like you say, some of my samples are really good. Some of them are not as good. But most of the time, I have to go looking for it to see the problem. It's not obvious during typical usage. So I would just advise caution about it. Like there's a lot of bad mouthing of WOLED at the moment because of it, but I don't think it's. I think it just needs to be taken in context, and and you see a lot of photos online on Reddit, and then every single photo is different because it's a different exposure, different camera, different brightness level, different gray pattern. These are not a good reflection necessarily. It's very hard to compare between them. Obviously, I'm not denying that some people experience the issue, but it's extremely hard to capture on a camera. And so, if you see pictures of a screen that you're interested in online and it's got grey banding, take that picture with a pinch of salt because it's not always going to be representative of what it really looks like in real use.
Yeah, that's right. I think, when we're testing monitors, you and me and a lot of other testers, we do put these screens through quite a lot of real world content. It's not just running test patterns and those sorts of things. My test suite includes lots of real content that we're trying to test. The B-roll capture that you see for the videos, we're playing a lot of games for that as well. And so, if this was a significant problem that was hurting the experience and we were seeing that in the real examples that we were looking at, we wouldn't be recommending these products. Like it's not like the banding issues sort of come out of nowhere and we're sort of like, oh, that's a surprise. Didn't see that in my testing. I did see it. It's just I only saw it in certain conditions that I think aren't relevant for most people. And when I was using it in the more realistic use cases, I didn't really find it to be a problem. So that's why I continue to recommend WOLED panels, despite people complaining about the grey banding and saying the things that you've been saying, like, oh, I won't buy one because I saw photos on Reddit of really bad banding on WOLEDs. That's really put me off. I mean, my review has a lot of B-roll in it, and I think you'll find it very difficult in a lot of those real scenes to see that in the footage. And certainly even on the worst example that I had, whichever that model was, the Asus or Gigabyte one, I can't remember, even on that model where I could see it with my eyes, it was still faint enough that it was very difficult to capture on camera and to show it to people when I was explaining it as a problem. Because I was saying, like, I can see this problem with this monitor, but then I'm trying to capture it and it's a really difficult problem to show in a way that doesn't really heavily exaggerate what it's actually looking like. Because, you can crank the exposure and there it is. Yeah. Is that a realistic reflection of what it looks like? And I tried in that review to show how it really sort of looked, and I think that sort of came across. But even then, like that monitor, would I have RMA'd it? Probably not. I think it probably would have improved after a few more compensation cycles. And then again, in most content, it was not noticeable. So, whether or not that makes WOLED like worse than QD-OLED, I mean, QD-OLED has its own flaws and problems as well. Things like the ambient light reflectivity, especially on some of the older panels, panel dimming. So there's no ultimate solution here that's providing everyone with all of the best features. I think WOLED still has some very, very strong strengths that counter out the banding, which is probably one of its biggest flaws at the moment. So it is what it is with these panel technologies.
Yeah, and we're always trying to make sure that the reviews are as complete and as representative of what the screen is like as we can. Like both of our reviews are incredibly in depth and detailed, and this is something that I'm exploring at the moment to see how I can incorporate it into testing in a consistent and repeatable way, and provide results that are representative. But at the same time, when you have something that is variable between different samples, it's very hard to bring that into a review, because although I can talk about my sample, it might not be representative of another person's sample. And it's the same with things like backlight bleed. If I get a good unit or a bad unit, it doesn't mean that yours is going to be the same. So I've always been cautious about talking about things that I know are going to be different. I think it's important to raise awareness of it as an issue and to put it into context, and for people to be aware of it and think about it in the right way, like we've just talked about. But I don't want to turn it into a huge issue and say, if I had a sample that was really bad, I don't know whether it would be fair to say, well, this one is terrible and therefore everything's terrible. And likewise, if mine is good, I don't know whether that's fair. So it's a tricky thing for people like you and I to cover, I think. But I think, as long as we're talking about it and raising awareness, then people can understand the situation. And, that only helps the panel manufacturers and the display manufacturers improve quality control and checks and look to improve these things in the future as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess it's a sort of similar thing with OLED flicker that people complain about in some VR applications. Can vary between the sorts of games you're playing, the panels that you've got, how you're using them. So it's one of those things that's very, very difficult to sort of say, well, that's going to be a problem for every single person or no one or whoever.
Yeah.
I do want to touch briefly before this podcast ends on G-Sync Pulsar, because that's also a thing that has launched right at the start of this year. Have you had a chance to test out G-Sync Pulsar for yourself yet?
No, I've only seen it in demo at CS, so I had a long conversation with NVIDIA about the technology, the future of it, the demos and everything. I do have the Asus Pulsar monitor here, but I'm waiting for a firmware update for it. So basically they've told me there is a firmware update pending, and so it makes sense for me to do that review when that is available, and I've been busy with other things. So I haven't hooked it up and tested it myself yet. I know you have, though. Is it as good as people... Like, I guess actually before that, like the thing I see people talk about with Pulsar is, oh, well, Pulsar's here, OLED is now dead. It's like, this is not, it's a great technology, and, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it from a motion clarity point of view, but this is not a replacement for OLED. It's a motion clarity improvement for LCDs. So yeah, great if you're a professional gamer, great if you're looking to drive higher motion clarity from lower refresh rates, but this isn't going to replace the contrast, the HDR performance, the viewing angles, the colors that you can get from an OLED. So, like, I'm intrigued to see what it offers, and where they might take it in the future as well, I suppose. How did you find it in your testing?
Yeah, it certainly isn't an OLED replacement. I mean, I guess if you think that the only benefit of OLED was its speed, then yes, in a way, it is an OLED replacement. I do think the G-Sync Pulsar monitor looks clearer than most OLEDs. I think the benefits, though, you do get a benefit at the highest refresh rates, but the real key thing that Pulsar can do is backlight strobing with variable refresh. So when you're getting down to those lower refresh rates, let's say 150 hertz, it is much clearer than an OLED at 150 hertz, because OLED is a sample and hold technology, just like LCD, and OLEDs can't do this level of strobing. And so once you're down at those sorts of medium-ish refresh rates, G-Sync Pulsar has a huge advantage, looks really clear, looks really good. So yeah, I guess my takeaway from testing it was, first of all, I was really impressed that they've solved this problem, because we've seen attempts at variable refresh plus backlight strobing on previous LCDs, ELMB sync, aim stabilizer sync, MPRT sync, I think, on MSI monitors. They've tried it, and it's never really worked that well. As soon as you drop maybe more than about 20 or 30 hertz below the maximum refresh rate, the double strobe that they usually implement just means that the monitor is blurry. You don't really get too much of a benefit. You've shown that in a lot of your reviews, and we've shown it in our reviews as well, that it's just not that beneficial. But the way that Pulsar works with these variable pulses that come in and out depending on the conditions, depending on how quickly you're ramping up and down refresh rates, they've been able to make this technology that works with variable refresh. It doesn't flicker. It gives you consistent brightness. It just works flawlessly. And so that was, from just a technical standpoint, I was really impressed. But then the actual clarity that you're getting in real-world gaming scenarios, specifically those multiplayer games where it really makes a difference, I found it was noticeable how good it looked, especially just because you can fire it up, you can use variable refresh. There's none of that configuration bloat that you kind of use with normal backlight strobing monitors, where you have to be like, oh, can I get the performance up to the point where I can lock the frame rate, and then I have to lock the frame rate and turn off variable refresh, turn off HDR, make sure that everything is locked down into this one configuration. With Pulsar, it's a plug and play experience. You just plug it in, you turn on Pulsar, it just works to give you the strobe clarity in all situations. So whether or not it's not a replacement for OLED, if you're looking at an OLED for all of OLED's benefits, I don't think it's offering you that. They claim G-Sync Pulsar works with HDR. I didn't do extensive HDR testing, but the panel clearly does not have extensive local dimming support. So it's not going to give you like the experience of those high-end locally dimmed LCDs, and certainly not OLED from black levels or any of those standpoints either. And so I think the overall experience that you get with something like, let's say, a 32-inch 4K 240 hertz OLED is probably going to be better for most people. But if you don't really use HDR gaming all that much, and you're just someone that plays titles like Battlefield, Call of Duty, Overwatch, but you don't want to deal with those TN monitors that are kind of garbage, low viewing angles, terrible contrast, and they're usually small panels as well, like 24-inch 1080p. You're actually getting a very good, at least based on what I haven't fully tested the monitor yet again, but seems like a good quality 27-inch 1440p panel, 360 hertz. Pulsar works really well out of the box. Seems to work flawlessly in terms of how that technology works. So if you're that sort of gamer, it seems to be a really good option. And on top of that, they're not that expensive at around $600 US. So you're not having to spend, some of those premium esports monitors have been like $800, $900, $1,000 US. Pulsar coming in at $600, offering all of this. I think that plus OLED options that are available for other use cases has pretty much killed off those TN options. I just don't really see why you would purchase, yes, I think I showed that ULMB2 on the PG248QP or whatever is like a little clearer in some situations. You get a bit more control over the strobe length and stuff like that. I just don't think that is good enough to outweigh all the benefits of Pulsar or getting an OLED monitor. So I think it'll be really hard for people to sell those TN monitors for esports. I think G-Sync Pulsar will be the go-to for those people.
Yeah, I think the only thing that is kind of keeping those TN film panels alive is the native small format. Some people still want to have a small 24-inch screen. They don't want to even use like a 27-inch and have it with one of the scaling modes or a low resolution. And then the native 1080p resolution seems to be that kind of combination that people still fall back on. So like to our point earlier about having a small format OLED, I still think there's potentially a niche, but there are a lot of people who would be just as well off with a 27-inch IPS Pulsar monitor or 27-inch OLED and use one of the built-in scaling modes, the 24.5-inch emulation mode. Yeah, it doesn't run at 1080p natively, but it's a lower resolution that you should be able to power more. I think the other good thing about Pulsar is that, NVIDIA has spent a couple of years at least refining that and optimizing that. So, the response times are, really good, about as good as you're going to get from an IPS panel. They've got vertical dependent overdrive so that you can eliminate the crosstalk at different parts of the screen. So as I understand it, the whole screen ends up looking clear at the same time. You don't have blurry regions and then cleared regions in the middle. So I think it's great that it's finally here. It does feel like it's maybe a year or two late. I saw that at Gamescom a couple of years ago in prototype stage. It's taken a long time to bring it to market. And I question whether a lot of people are still even considering a 27-inch 360 hertz 1440p IPS screen. But I'm intrigued now to see where they take this with the next displays, because the delay they told me was all about getting the G-Sync software and the G-Sync capabilities working on the new MediaTek scaler. So they moved away now from their old G-Sync module, which was proprietary, and their own module that had limitations, to using a third-party scaler that now has, all the connectivity options that you could want and everything. But it's been difficult getting their NVIDIA stuff onto that. But now they have. It should be a lot quicker to now incorporate that into other displays. And I know they told me they were still working on an Acer screen that we both saw at Computex. I think it was last year in 2025, 5K dual mode, mini LED, I think, as well. Certainly, was it mini LED? It was 32 inch. I
honestly cannot remember.
Yeah,
it was 32-inch 5K though, at the very least.
I remember that. So that, that's a next step forward. And, if you could combine that with dual mode, then you've got that kind of 5K native 1440p dual mode that we talked about earlier. And then mini LED, I said, could you get this working on mini LED? The answer is yes. They're exploring it. There's no details at the moment, but I expect that to come at some point. Likewise with OLED, could you incorporate a MediaTek scaler with all the G-Sync capabilities and add Pulsar to an OLED? And I think the answer is also yes. So that could move us away from this kind of limited BFI implementation that we've seen so far, which is kind of a cobbled together scaler, add a black frame every, half the refresh rate, which limits at what speeds you can even use it. It's a good stopgap, but what you really want is something that's can be run up to the native full refresh rate, can be run at the same time as VRR, doesn't have all this kind of clunky behavior when you want to turn it on and off. So if they could add that to OLED, I mean, that would be exceptional for then improving the motion clarity at lower frame rates, lower VRR situations, and knowing that, you've got a super fast panel and you're not having to sacrifice in everything else like HDR and contrast and things like you do on IPS. So I hope they continue to invest in it. They told me they would be. I don't think it's finally get it out the door and then leave it and forget about it. I think this is a future thing that NVIDIA are going to look at. So yeah, I'm intrigued to see where it goes.
Yeah, I do agree what you said earlier about they probably left it a little too late. I think, if they're trying to get the technology to have a foothold in the market, it definitely would have been better to launch it 2 years ago, or maybe even before OLED sort of really started to dominate, because then people will at least be a bit more aware of it now, whereas currently, all the focus, all the talk is generally on OLED monitors. But there are still people that we hear from that are very interested in using the LCDs for the performance for esports games and those sorts of things. And I think, the 5K option is interesting in a sense that, getting it at a high resolution would be nice. I personally would like to see them almost go the other way and implement Pulsar as more of a competitor to things like DIAC from BenQ or even, NVIDIA's older ULMB technology, and just sort of have these maybe 24-inch 1080p or 24-inch 1440p monitors that are really high refresh rate, like 500 hertz plus, but offering Pulsar as well, so that, for people that do want these esports focused products, they don't have to deal with the problems of TN or the problems of the highly restrictive nature of backlight strobing, and they can just use Pulsar with maybe a more capable panel. Because I think, if you're thinking about what esports gamers want, they're not necessarily after the other benefits of OLED, like black levels, if anything, can be a detriment in some situations because they will want to use things like shadow boosting. So they want to kind of raise the blacks anyway so they can actually see enemies in shadows. They prefer the smaller sizes and sometimes the lower resolutions because they're easier to run. They want super high refresh rates, things like strobing. I think Pulsar can form a niche for those use cases, but certainly for like even the 27-inch 360 hertz model that they've currently made, I think, yes, for most people, I would say probably get an OLED instead, but it's a great screen that I think if you're more in that multiplayer gaming category, you should definitely still be considering buying it for those purposes. Now, to be fair, some people have, I do, as more of a single player gamer, I do have to talk to multiplayer gamers to get their opinions a bit more on what they're after. I have heard that some more recent games, HDR is becoming more important for enemy visibility. So I think titles like Battlefield 6, I've been told that HDR is actually superior to SDR for multiplayer gaming. It's easier to spot enemies with the dynamic range benefits that you get on HDR. So that could swing back more towards the OLED side of things if games continue to progress and give people those benefits in those types of games. So that is definitely something to have a watch on over time to see how the game side of things progresses. But for a lot of other multiplayer titles, the more graphically basic games like Valorant and CSGO or CS2, Overwatch, those sorts of things, the preference still seems to be the high performance TN LCDs for the like pro level gaming, which I think G-Sync Pulsar should probably overtake at some point, but then again, they probably do need to push up the refresh rate a little bit just because the latest competitive monitors are, the 500 hertz TNs. So if they can get the tech working at those sorts of refresh rates to give the input lag benefits and all those sorts of things, I think they'll have a real winner in that niche of competitive gaming. So yeah, hopefully they do continue development, but they've shown it's possible. So the tech definitely works. So we'll see what they can do with it across a lot of other formats.
Yeah, and it could become the gold standard for LCD, strobing blur reduction backlights because, you've got all of the other benefits from the NVIDIA G-Sync scaler. You've got the variable overdrive as well, the potential to add things like reflex latency analyzer that some people like to use, all these kind of G-Sync features, optimized panels, optimized response times, that could be, like you say, a great alternative to like BenQ's DIAC, to ULMB, which that was a precursor to Pulsar anyway. So yeah, I think it could be really popular in that kind of competitive esports market, or even for kind of semi-serious gamers who just don't have a powerful enough system to push the kind of upper limits of the refresh rate. Gaming at lower refresh rates is suddenly now a lot clearer and a lot better. So yeah, I think good that they finally brought it to market. Shame it took, a couple of years, but at least it's finally here. And at least, like you said earlier, they're not crazy money either. I really expected them to be like $1,000 for one of those screens, because that's what previous kind of high-end LCDs of that type have been. But 600 is, very good.
Maybe they were going to originally target those higher price points, but I think $1,000 for the screen that they've offered is probably not competitive at all in the current market. So I don't think they really could have offered it for $1,000 when you've got the 1440p 540 hertz OLEDs in that sort of category. I think it probably wouldn't have sold very well. So yeah, maybe that delay has cost them a bit of revenue in that sense. But the price point that they're offering it for now, I think, is suitable.
Yeah, and we saw models. I think there's 4 already. There's Asus, Acer, MSI, and AOC. They've all got a model, same spec, same panel, but just slightly different features.
I guess that pretty much will wrap us up for this episode of the Hardware Unboxed podcast. Thanks to Simon from TFTCentral for joining us on this week's episode. If you want to see all of Simon's reviews and testing and maybe that analysis into WOLED banding that we talked about, check out TFTCentral on YouTube and also their website, tftcentral.co.uk. If you want all that information, great resource for some additional testing and monitor reviews, very in-depth. We really rate your testing. So check all that out. Aside from that, thanks for listening to this episode. We always do like to come on and talk about displays at least a couple of times a year. I know a lot of the focus of this podcast is usually the other sorts of PC gaming hardware, but I love talking about displays. So we do want to come on and talk about that. So thanks for listening to this episode. If you want to support Hardware Unboxed, we've got Patreon. You get access to the ad-free version of this podcast, as well as plenty of other benefits like our Discord community, all sorts of other cool perks, I guess you could say. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.